This video will review the Excel skills you need to complete case number 2, Advanced Filter and Database Functions. Before I show you how to set up an advanced filter, let me quickly review what an auto filter can and can't do. So an auto filter, or a simple filter, allows you to filter, but the filters are additive. So for example, in this case, we can show everyone in Department D and everyone in Toronto. But what a filter, auto filter, cannot do is answer the question Department D or location Toronto. That is not possible to do, which is why we need to do an advanced filter. But before we can issue the advanced filter command, we have to set up a criteria range. We have to set up the question, and we do that by copying the column headings from the table and pasting them outside the table. And then underneath the column headings, you set up what it is you want to see. So for example, under department, we set up D, and one row below, under the location heading, you set up Toronto. You can type in Toronto or copy and paste it. So this constitutes a criteria range, and notice that Toronto and D are on separate rows, and that implies that the word or connects the two of them. Again, this means Department D or location is Toronto. Once we have a criteria range, now we click or select a cell inside the table and issue an advanced filter command from the data ribbon. The list range should automatically select your table. The criteria range is the location of your criteria, including the column headings. And remember, the column headings have to match exactly the column headings in your table. And then what will happen, the filter the list in place, is the rows that don't match the criteria will be temporarily hidden and the row numbers will turn blue. So this is a longer list because remember, it's Department D or Toronto. Department D or Toronto. Department D or Toronto. Let's make the criteria range a little bit more complex. But before we do that, let's remove the filter that's in place. So click on any cell in your results, and go to click on the filter icon once. That removes the hidden rows, and click again to remove the drop-down arrows. So let's do Department D, and we'll add salary to our criteria range, and we'll put greater than 75,000. So this criteria range now is a little more complicated. What does it mean? It means Department D and greater than 75,000 salary, or because you're on a different row, Department D and Toronto. So in both cases it's Department D, but it's Toronto or greater than 75,000. So now we go back into the table, issue the advanced filter command, and simply edit the criteria range to include the column headings. And now our list shows everyone is in Department D in both cases, but it's either Toronto or the salary is greater than 75,000. Toronto or the salary is greater than 75,000. Okay, let's remove the results and move on to the database functions. Functions you recognize as sum, count, count A, and average, with the D in front of them, means they work with a table and they require the use of a criteria range. So before you can use DSUM, DCOUNT, DAVERAGE, you have to set up a criteria range exactly the way you would for an advanced filter. So if you wanted to do a DSUM for, let's do a different example here. We will add up the salaries for everyone who's in Department C or D. Okay, so our question criteria will be department C or D. So let's go to the insert function button and find the DSUM function. In the box for database, you have to select the range of your table. Now the field is the column that will be summed. The field is the column that will be summed, and there are 3 ways to input the field. My way, the easiest way, is to simply to click on the name of the column heading that you want to sum. So I click on D9. But you can also type 4, and the 4 represents the 4th column of the table, or in quotation marks you can type in the name of the field. So either method works. I find simply clicking on the column heading is the fastest and easiest way, and then the criteria is the criteria that you've entered at the top of your worksheet. And so there's your answer. That's the sum of all the salaries that are for department C or D. Now let's do DCOUNT. And again, before you issue the database function, you have to set up your criteria. So let's do department C or location North York. So this will be our criteria range for DCOUNT. We want to count the number of salaries that are in department C or in North York. Right. So we'll DCOUNT. DCOUNT, like all count functions, can only count cells that contain numbers. So we have to keep repeating our database location, including the column headings. The field is the name of the field or the column that we wish to count. And count only counts numbers, so we have to select the salary field, and then based on our criteria, and the answer is 256. There are 256 cells that contain salaries that are department C or North York. We can get the same result by counting the IDs instead of the salaries, but in that case we have to select the DCOUNTA function, because that function counts text as well as numbers. So we keep repeating the location of the database range. The field is the column heading that we are going to count. So this time we're counting ID, and again based on whatever criteria we want at the top. So we'll get the same answer as we had before. And the last example is DAVERAGE, which works exactly the same way as all the others. Always begin by selecting the entire table, including the headings. And what field are you averaging? Well, in this case, you can only average the salaries because that's our only numeric field. And again, whatever criteria we wish to have, we select it and we click OK. And that's the average salary, $65,000, for employees who work in Department C or who work in North York. That concludes the review of the Excel skills you need for completing case number 2.